Welcome back, Jimmy Sullivan. Chris Baccio with you. Now, pleased to be joined by author David Krell. He is the author and editor of The New York Mets in Popular Culture, a series of critical essays. You can see the book right there. David, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us here today. How are you?
I'm great, Jimmy. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for being here. And before we get into the book, we are recording this interview just a couple of days after the Los Angeles Dodgers won the World Series for the first time since 1988. As a lot of Mets fans know, the Dodgers and Mets are pretty inextricably linked, given the history of the Mets and how they came into being after the Dodgers and Giants went out west. David, I'm just curious as to what your reaction was to watching the Dodgers win it all on Tuesday night.
Well, it's certainly good for Brooklynites, or maybe bad for Brooklynites who really have a bad taste in their mouth since the late 50s. But there is a nexus, as you guys know, between Los Angeles and Brooklyn. The Brooklyn team went to LA in 1958, and they've had a lot of success there. You can't help but think about 1988 because the Mets could have gone all the way that year. And a lot of people favored the Mets to beat the Dodgers in the playoffs. But that wasn't what the fates allowed or intended. And I think it was a good thing for baseball when you have the LA Dodgers in the World Series for the first time in 30 years, or the first legitimate contender in quite some time. I shouldn't say that, I'm sorry. They were in the World Series a few times, but this one was the first that they won in 30 years. That's always good for baseball. It's a good story. It's like the Cubs winning after a big drought. Now the Dodgers finally got their title after a big drought. So I'm very happy for them and for my fellow Dodger fans.
And sticking in 1980s, because you mentioned that National League Championship Series with a Mets team in the 80s that is the intrigue of Mets history to me. And that's, of course, a generation before Jimmy and myself, but really my father's generation, where some excellent Met teams, one World Series Met team.
Right.
You talk about in the book some of the pernicious effects of what was winning, being dominant. I'm curious if you could go into that, how this team that was so good sort of wasn't able to do more when they very well could have.
Well, you have to remember when Dwight Gooden came in 1984 and had that explosive season, it was so glorious, partly because the Mets had been bad for so long. Ever since Seaver was traded in 77, we just suffered through some really bad years. All of a sudden, here comes this kid who isn't even old enough to buy beer and is firing that ball at 100 miles an hour. So that really brought a lot of joy and hope. And it was realized, I think, that was 84. So 86 is when they won against the Red Sox. In 85, of course, we got Gary Carter. That proved to be integral. But I think what you're getting at is the aura of the Mets, and the aura in that decade of the 80s, which some might say it was a decadent decade. I talked to Paul Hensler, who authored the essay about the 86 Mets, and I said, we have to put this in context because there might be some younger fans like yourselves who don't understand because pop culture sometimes gets lost. And I'm a nostalgia guy. So I said, let's inject some nostalgia. What was going on in the decade? You had Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. That show would never get on the air today because of what's going on in the culture. But we glorified decadence. We glorified luxury. And there was a swagger in pop culture. There was a swagger to J.R. Ewing, who was the main character on Dallas, and you either loved him or you hated him. Joan Collins played Alexis Carrington on Dynasty, and that was another character, just had this cockiness, this arrogance. Ghostbusters, the Bill Murray character, Michael Douglas playing Gordon Gekko in Wall Street. There was just this resonance going on. And if you read Jeff Pearlman's book, The Bad Guys Won, you see that attitude all through the book and what the Mets were really about. Now, we might not have known that at the time as fans, but looking back, when you read Jeff's book, it kind of makes sense. And when you go through the Holland Tunnel, or the Lincoln Tunnel rather, in those days, and you see the big mural of Dwight Gooden on that building, just as soon as you get to New York, there was something really delicious about it for Mets fans because the Yankees had dominated the culture. We have 69 and 73, you gotta believe. But the Yankees have Ruth and Gehrig and Mantle and DiMaggio and Reggie and Billy, and they dominated our attention for so long. So finally, we got something of our own. We had the spotlight. And if you listen to Howie Rose talk about the 80s, especially the mid 80s, he has said the Mets owned the city at that time. And that had never been done before.
Talking with David Krell, author and editor of the New York Mets in Popular Culture. David, I think your book does a really good job in the series of essays in explaining the aura of the Mets. And I think a big part of that goes back to the 1960s, a decade in which on the field, other than 1969, the Mets were largely very bad, but they came into existence and they were immediately very popular. You even, there was one point in the copy that I read that said that while the Yankees were still really good in the early 60s, the Mets were getting all the love in their first couple of seasons.
Right.
I'm sure there's a number of factors for that. And obviously, I wasn't there, but why do you think that would be, that a team like the Yankees could be so successful, but a team like the Mets that goes out and starts its history by losing 120 games winds up getting all the love? Why do you think that is?
Well, I've talked to fans who were around at that time, and they say that the one thing that nobody talks about is when they lost to the Dodgers and the Giants, it was difficult to follow them closely. So they're out in California. When the Mets come into being in 1962, guess what happens? Those guys are coming back. When they have road trips and they're going through Philly and New York, you're going to get to see them play. You're going to get to see Willie Mays again, and Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale. Now, folks like Duke Snider might have been at the end of their careers, but you had a lot of people who really engendered a lot of love. And to see the National League stars coming back, not just the Dodgers, Giants, but other folks, it was really a hidden jewel and a hidden asset for the Mets to market to fans. And I think that's why the fans loved them. You had 4 years where the Yankees were the only game in town, 58, 59, 60, 61. So finally, there's another outlet for people who used to follow the National League.
And of course, integral to that period of time in Mets history is Tom Seaver, the greatest pitcher in the history of the franchise. And of course, the baseball world lost him just a couple months ago. Yes. In August. So my question to you is, Tom Seaver, how big of a deal is he? We know he is an enormous deal, but what does he mean to the history, the culture of this franchise?
Well, whatever people talk about, multiplied by 50. Because when he came onto the Mets in 67 and then 68, Gil Hodges comes in and he kind of transforms the team from that lovable losers persona that the press had stuck on them for so long to, no, this is a business. These are competitors. These are professionals. We're not going to talk about lovable losers anymore. And then the following year, they won the series. Seaver just injected that stardom, that humility, that excellence. And I dare say that he's still not fully recognized. When you talk about pitchers of his era in the 60s and 70s, he doesn't always get mentioned first. And I think he ought to. We should have a statue of him. I understand we'll have one. But when he was traded, Chris, he did not want to go, except for the Mets were making it really difficult during the salary negotiations. And also Dick Young, the Daily News columnist, referenced his wife. And there's a line. You don't mention families in sports articles. There's a line that you just don't cross. And when he said that Nancy Seaver was jealous because she's friends with Nolan Ryan's wife and Nolan Ryan was making more money, that's, as the story goes, when Tom Seaver went to the front office and said, get me out. And then he went to Cincinnati and we got 4 players in return. So that's the long answer. The short answer is you can't say enough about Mr. Seaver and what he represented. And that's not to take anything away from Jerry Koosman or John Matlack or some of the other great pitchers. We actually have an essay in the book about the pitching staff between 69 and 73 and how they're underrated and underanalyzed in terms of the pantheon of pitching in the early 70s.
You talk about that pitching staff in the book, and Tom Seaver is obviously the franchise, and he's probably the greatest player in the history of the Mets. But another player that's getting recognized and was supposed to be this year, but that's obviously been pushed back, is Jerry Koosman. He was supposed to have his number retired during the season. That ceremony wound up not happening because of when it was supposed to be and the coronavirus. But when you think about a guy like Jerry Koosman, who I think is kind of underrated, as you said, what do you think that means to Mets fans that he'll have his number up there alongside Seaver and Hodges and Stengel and Piazza?
Well, I think for Mets fans of a certain age, people who were around in the 60s and 70s who saw him play, they will say it's a long time coming. And there's some rule, I think it's an unwritten rule about not retiring a number unless the person's in the Hall of Fame. And it looks like the Mets are showing some flexibility on that front, but he's certainly beloved, and he was a major part of that 69 season.
One of the chapters in the book goes into the West Wing, one that you wrote. And I'm a big fan of the show. And, you talk about Josh Lyman, the character in the show, and that he represents some of the swagger of the New York Mets, of the era that he may have been coming of age. And one of those points is hope. And the Mets are so tied to hope. You got to believe. And of course, what they're able to do in 1986 in the unlikely fashion that it happened. Do you speak a little bit to that and the connection with the West Wing?
Well, if you watch the West Wing, you know that Josh is the optimistic one. He's the one who's always trying to find a way to work something out, whether it's a bill, whether it's a Supreme Court justice nomination. And it's really Toby, who's the Yankees fan, who is more obstinate. It's Toby who seems more entitled at times. It's Toby who gets really angry if things don't automatically go the way of the Bartlett administration. So there was a nice juxtaposition. And when I thought about the chapter, I said, gee, wait a minute, there is a swagger about Josh. There is a hope. That no wonder he's a Mets fan. There is something there. And Richard Schiff is certainly a big celebrity Yankees fan and has been for decades. So to write that was really, really interesting. And I think if people haven't seen the show, they ought to stream it or buy it on Blu-ray or DVD, because it is a pretty good antidote for what's going on and viciousness of politics nowadays.
One of my favorite quotes out of that show was Toby's talking about Yankee Stadium. He says, I've been to 441 games. There is not a single person there who's ordinary. Moving on, I feel like we can't do this interview without me asking you, because it's a big part of the book. There's an essay in there about Joan Patterson, the original matriarch of the franchise, just how much she meant, her immense philanthropic contributions. Just how much did Joan Patterson not only mean to the Mets, but also mean to the community around her? How beneficial was her presence in stewarding the Mets in their early existence?
Oh, tremendously beneficial, Jimmy. She loved the game. And you might not expect that from somebody who collects $1 million pieces of art, or goes to the opera, or is a member of the Whitney family, which she was. The Whitney Museum is one example of many with the Whitney family name on it. And I just think that she should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't know why she's not. She was integral to getting the Mets off the ground. She was a Giants stockholder. She dissolved when they moved to San Francisco, dissolved her ownership. And then when the Mets franchise became available, she was the one. And just really a marvelous lady. Didn't have a luxury box. She sat right in front at the dugout. She kibitzed with the coaches and the managers. I mean, there are pictures online of her talking with Yogi Berra before a game. There was none of this nonsense where they had to call the owner to break down the game, pitch by pitch or batter by batter, and what went wrong and specifics that you hear about so often in any sport. But I think that she really is underrated when it comes to owners. And there's only one woman in the Hall of Fame, as you guys know, Effa Manley, who owns the Newark Eagles of the Negro Leagues. It's time we have a second woman in there, and it ought to be Joan Patterson.
David, a question about Shea Stadium. There's an essay on Shea in the book as well, and really personifies the Mets in a lot of ways. Scrappy, and I have very early memories of it. But of course, the era of Shea Stadium is now over. But your thoughts on how that contributes to the energy of the New York Mets, all the concerts that were hosted there,
Right.
and just what it means to the franchise.
Well, remember that Shea Stadium was built in '64, or it opened in '64. And that meant that it was new for a new ball club. The Astrodome, same thing. They opened in '65. The Astros opened the Astrodome in '65. So it was synonymous with something being new. And I think that's what drew people to it. I drew people to it. I think that's why it became an icon. People talk about Shea with a certain reverence. They don't talk about Veterans Stadium with the same reverence. And my theory is because you're talking about something that was new for a new ball club. And there were so many rock concerts, as you mentioned. The Beatles, obviously, that was the one that kicked it off. But there were stars who just fled there. And it's interesting because you would think, well, Yankee Stadium. Why not Yankee Stadium? Why not Dodger Stadium? But Shea really was the place that one rock star described the top of the mountain. And it's interesting that he would say top of the mountain to describe a ballpark in Queens and not these other ballparks that are certainly more glamorous, certainly have more history, but there was something cutting edge about it.
David, before we let you go, can't end this without asking you about your reaction to the current state of the Mets.
Right.
Looks like the sale to Steve Cohen is going to go through, but for the possible intervention of New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, it's still not entirely clear if he's going to go along with that sale. As a fan, just what's your reaction to what's going on with the Mets and their sale right now?
Well, if the mayor stops the sale or tries to in any significant way, I think that's bad for baseball. I think it's bad for the city. It's certainly bad for the Mets. We spent a long time trying to get a new owner, and we spent a long time hoping for a new owner. Just nothing against the Wilpons, but maybe someone with fresh blood. Maybe it's time to give someone else a chance. And I think that I think that there's nothing to be gained from standing in the way of a guy who wants to own the team, treat the team well, treat the people in the New York area well, whether they're Mets or Yankees fans. If the Mets are good and the Yankees are good, that's just better for the city. That's more people watching baseball. That's more viewers on television. That's more people buying sweatshirts and hats and jerseys. Why would he want to step in front of that? Why would he want to step in front of Mr. Cohen wanting to lay down the money to buy this team? And from all we see, invest in it. Invest in free agents, invest in maybe refurbishing the ballpark, updating it. Who knows? I don't see anything to be gained, quite frankly, Jimmy. I don't know why there's this cat and mouse political game going on, whether it's for headlines or to flex muscles. I really don't know. And I hope it gets resolved soon.
As do I think the both of us, and we'll hope
too.
that it does. He's David Krell, author and editor of The New York Mets and Popular Culture, a series of critical essays. David, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you, guys. Take care.